Easy Explain Ethics by Spinoza, second part of the mind. So the full title of this part is called The Second Part of the Ethics of the Nature and Origin of the Mind. And Spinoza actually starts out here by focusing on the body as an alternative. And Spinoza defines the body as, by body I understand a mode that in a certain indeterminate way expresses God's essence insofar as he is considered an extended thing. This goes back to part one in Spinoza defining God, and that God's essence is his existence, and that God is everything. God is all. God is all of nature. So God has the attribute of extension to some degree, and bodies are that expression of God. Then moving on to definition 3 in the second part, we're going to start to get into more of the mental cognitive definitions. So Spinoza defines what he means by an idea here, and he says, by idea I understand a concept of the mind, which the mind forms because it is a thinking thing. And this goes back to some Cartesian sentiments, right, that the mind is a thinking thing, it's not extended. So Spinoza is kind of adopting that here as well. And moving into the propositions of this part, we're going to start looking at ideas and what they really can be like. Spinoza says all ideas, insofar as they are related to God, are true. Now we need to clarify what it means to have a true idea. Moving into proposition 36, again, this is going to be a little Cartesian in nature. Spinoza says inadequate and confused ideas follow with the same necessity as adequate or clear and distinct ideas. So he's saying that, yes, you can have some ideas that are inadequate and confused or not clear and not distinct. Spinoza adopts a new term for being clear and distinct. He just calls them adequate. So if you're going to have an idea about God that's clear and distinct or adequate, he would say that's true. But he's going to say, humans, our minds are just as subject to having inadequate and confused ideas as they are adequate and clear and distinct ones. Moving on to proposition 38, the corollary we find there. Spinoza says, from this it follows that there are certain ideas or notions common to all men, called these common notions or common sense. For all bodies agree in certain things which must be perceived adequately or clearly and distinctly by all. So he would say these ideas are clear and distinct or adequate ideas of God. This is a common notion, or we might even go farther and say it's true understanding. So as we move into proposition 40, Spinoza is going to give us these pretty big concepts that are actually going to come up again throughout his ethics. So it's very important that we hit them here and get a solid understanding of them here. He defines 3 kinds of knowledge, and these become a pretty big theme for him throughout his ethics. The first kind is imagination and opinions. So not that clear, not that distinct, not really adequate. Right? You're entitled to your own imagination and opinions. It doesn't make them true. Second kind of knowledge, we're going up on a spectrum of truth here, on a sliding scale of truth. We're going to get to reason, those common notions he had just mentioned, and adequate ideas, these clear and distinct ideas. But Spinoza even has a higher kind of knowledge, and he calls this intuition or true understanding, to truly understand something. And he says this kind of knowledge proceeds from an adequate idea of the formal essence of certain attributes of God to the adequate knowledge of the formal essence of things. So again, this goes back to the idea that if we have a very adequate idea of God, it must be true, right? It goes up to what he said earlier. Moving on here to proposition 43, the scholium there. Hence it is as necessary that the mind's clear and distinct ideas, or adequate ideas, are true as that God's ideas are. So since that God is all, God is everything, God is nature, and we're extended bodies living in that nature, if we have a truly understood adequate idea, that idea is so true that it might as well be one of God's ideas, right? They're pretty comparable when we're getting to that level of true understanding. Moving on to proposition 44, it is of the nature of reason to regard things as necessary, not as contingent. So he's pointing out here that if you're reasoning, reason has this tendency to think of everything that's observed and happening as necessary. But Spinoza wants to point out that there is such a thing as contingency, things that happen a little more according to chance, or so can be seemed as such. And we're just going to clear that up here in regards to his determinism versus his free will. In proposition 48, he says, in the mind there is no absolute or free will, but the mind is determined to will this or that by a cause which is also determined by another, and this again by another, and so to infinity. So essentially he's saying that free will doesn't really exist. In the mind you might think it does, but in actuality everything is determined by events So, the true understanding here is that things do seem to be necessary in God. But to clarify this idea even further, we go to Proposition 49, where Spinoza says, in the mind there is no volition or affirmation and negation, except that which the idea involves insofar as it is an idea. So here, again, most of life is determined or predetermined. We can have the idea of free will, but that's really where free will stops, that we can affirm or negate something. And we're going to get a little bit more into this when we look at his effects and human bondage and human freedom and how we can sort of have some manipulation over how we respond to things, getting into that neo-stoicism of his. But that's for next time. So for now, I hope this helps.